By definition, a historic district is a group of buildings, properties, or sites that have been designated by one of several entities as historically or architecturally significant and protected by a process of public review. Historic districts have their origins with the movement for historic preservation, which gets started in the 1920s and 30s when a mania for all things colonial swept across America. This is the period in which Colonial Williamsburg was created, for instance, crafting a landscape that demolished buildings that did not date to the 1790s and rebuilding replicas of buildings that had been lost over time. The first historic district was in Charleston in 1931. The city designated the first historic district in the country and also created the first zoning guidelines for historic areas. After becoming a local district in 1931, Charleston received national designation in 1944. The development of the historic landscape of Charleston was focused on nostalgia, and specifically nostalgia for the colonial period. There, an area was permanently zoned as historic, and retrospectively we can see that this area was also a laboratory in which the most important urban preservation techniques were pioneered, such as private restoration programs by real estate agents, historical zoning, the creation of a board of architectural review, surveys of architectural resources, and the creation of a revolving fund to preserve and restore structures. A second historic district was created in the New Orleans French Quarter in 1936. After that, there's not as much happening until 1966, when the National Preservation Act was passed. A historical district is generally an area most likely to be noted by some kind of marker or memorial, or constituting some kind of tableau, a legible or comprehensible landscape that supports many stories about the past and the present, visually pleasing, architecturally coherent, imageable. And so the offerings of many historic districts that have these qualities are also public ones where tourism is often encouraged and where there are a mixture of many ingredients, such as a waterfront, warehouse districts, old town plans, public markets, local celebrations, and carnivals or festivals, all of which we have in the New Orleans French Quarter. Southern locations were prominent among early historic districts, and they became much more a focus of urban planning as well in the post-war period in the United States. Two early examples of this period are instructive. First, let's look at Savannah, which was established as a historic district in 1966. The motivation to preserve historic structures in Savannah began in the 1950s, when a federal-era home, the Davenport home, was threatened with demolition. The Historic Savannah Foundation was created in 1955 to develop a comprehensive strategy to remote preservation through private sector involvement. One early activity was an architectural inventory of buildings within the landmark district, which was completed in 1962 prior to the designation of the area as a National Historic Landmark District in 1966. And the area that was specifically mapped was the area containing this, what's represented in this map here on the right, which is Oglethorpe's original plan for the city. After the state legislature authorized the city to create historic zoning in Savannah, a historic review board was established in 1973 and ushering in a new era of regulated development within the historic district. In Savannah as elsewhere, historic preservation went hand in hand with urban renewal, and unfortunately, that also included the raising of a historic black neighborhood here on this side adjacent to the historic district. There's still actually a historic black church located there today, but the neighborhood's largely gone. It also allowed Savannah to preserve, as part of the original Oglethorpe plan, the colonial and federal era architecture, which is distinctive to the city, as well as the many squares that are scattered throughout the city grid mapped out in the 18th century. A second very different example is Lowell, Massachusetts, which was established as a historic district in 1978. Lowell was part of the Model Cities program, and here the creation of a historic district and park was tied to community economic development, since Lowell, during this period, suffered from deindustrialization and had high crime and unemployment. They sought to build an economic future for the city on the quality of its past. And just to show you where Lowell is located, it's up here in northern Massachusetts, right there near the border with New Hampshire. The historic core of Lowell is the Old Mill City, which is treated as a museum and park, including a complex of mill structures, dams, canals, and institutional buildings. Heritage buildings, such as the mills and the lodging houses and canals, are landscaped. Culture and other symbolism replace the previous image of decline. So we get the stories of the mid-19th century Lowell girls who left their father's farms and moved to town to work in the textile mills before getting married. We see the surviving structures of the mills, such as boot mills, and the weaving room, an environment where visitors can experience the dust and noise of the original shop floor. Now the work being done at Lowell is service-oriented, not industrial, and it's much less possible to see or experience the lives of contemporary immigrants who labor in Lowell's economy outside of the historic national park. And here you can see the confluence of the two rivers, the Pawtucket and the Merrimack, and then the mill district here. There's several mills all around, as well as a series of canals that form the heart of the historic park. Lowell represents the double erasures of culture-led strategies in the park context, and that has two sides, right, as double suggests. One, places lose their primary reason for being, and two, culture strategies remove places and events from the realm of everyday experience and places them in the realm of abstraction. So Lowell is no longer a place where industrial work is done. It's an abstract representation of what a place was when industrial work was done there. Part of this abstraction is how a place is frozen in time and organized in a way that the urban environment can be carefully controlled and maintained in its desired historic state. This involves a preoccupation with one dramatic episode or period as the locality's place in national history. As a colonial port, for instance, in the case of Savannah, as an industrial district in the case of Lowell, or perhaps a boom town, a railroad town, a river town, or other places that were part of the story of the nation's economic history. These two examples suggest some of the reasons to establish a historic district. Districting creates zoning, which offers protection to historic structures in the area, and the landscapes they create, governing scale and style, and promoting preservation of buildings and other structures. Districting allows for regulation of uncontrolled development. It provides access to resources for redevelopment, such as tax incentives, federal grant monies. Districting also increases or stabilizes property values in aging neighborhoods. And finally, it provides opportunities for branding, marketing, and tourism. We can see these benefits at work in other examples, as well as some of the potential downsides of districting. Often the creation of historic districts accompanies some form of urban renewal or neoliberal development. Historical districting is often a precursor to the revitalization of urban areas, especially in the last 30 years. Lodo, or Lower Downtown in Denver, Colorado, is one example, a warehouse district that was recognized in 1988 by the city of Denver. This area was revitalized in the 1990s with the construction of Coors Field and adaptive reuse of old industrial and warehouse structures. Along with Larimer Square, a 19th century area adjacent to Lodo, the Denver city economy was served well by the creation of a walkable landscape, including pedestrian mall lined with restaurants, breweries, and cultural venues. Sites in Lodo include sites like the former Spratlan Anderson Wholesale Grocery Company, which is down in the right-hand corner, which is now upscale lofts. El Chapultepec, a legendary jazz bar, and then other manufacturing and warehouse buildings, especially those related to saddlery and other Western outfitting industries, as well as a railroad depot and historic hotel that represent an older history of the city as a transportation trade hub in the Rocky Mountain West. Historical districting, especially at the local level, can protect structures, but it cannot always assure their preservation and reuse. This requires investment, sometimes significant investment. So landscapes that are commercially viable, as Lodo became, or viable as tourist destinations, lend themselves to this approach. Sometimes preservation and districting leads to investment in buildings, but not the people who live in them. Sites are preserved, property values rise, but people and communities are displaced. This was certainly the case in Society Hill in Philadelphia, listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1971. 20 years before, Society Hill was an aging colonial neighborhood. And it's located, as you can see here, in the historic part of Philadelphia, right along the riverfront, the southern riverfront. In the 1950s and 60s, urban planner Edmund Bacon, father of Kevin, shown up there in the upper right-hand corner, seized on Society Hill as part of reimagining post-war Philadelphia as a colonial destination. 19th century structures were demolished, historic market was relocated, historically significant houses were restored by occupants or taken over by the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority and sold to individuals who agreed to restore the exteriors. Replicas of 18th century street lights and brick sidewalks were added to enhance the colonial atmosphere and support what we would now call branding of the city, defined by its colonial era for touristic purposes, including the creation of adjacent Independence Historic National Park, which is just to the north of this neighborhood. Preserving colonial homes and building new structures that mirrored the same aesthetic transformed this area from a slum to a she neighborhood. You have to be rich to live in Society Hill now. In doing so, however, it also displaced the historic black community that had lived in the southern area of this district since colonial times. Now Society Hill is a destination for tourists who come to eat at City Tavern or wander the cobblestone streets, and gentrification has spread from this area since the 1980s to neighborhoods directly south and continues to this day, going literally into 3 neighborhoods down from Society Hill. Sometimes tourism can also feed a market-driven approach to preservation. And when preservation is dependent on the market, districting can protect areas, but there's no guarantee that preservation will happen without significant historic and financial investment. This can lead to fragmentation, as we see in the Sweet Auburn Historic District in Atlanta. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with this, especially having done your walking tour. Designated in 1976, the name Sweet Auburn was coined by John Wesley Dobbs, referring to the richest Negro street in the world, one of the largest concentrations of African American businesses in the United States during the Jim Crow era. The historic district spans 19 acres and includes the Martin Luther King National Historic Site, which was designated in 1980 as a national landmark after being added to the National Register in 1974. This is what it looks like today. The King site was redeveloped as a National Historic Site. This is what it looked like in 1983, and eventually a national park. This is what it looked like before the National Park Service took over. The preservation of the house of the great man, Dr. King, his birth home, enabled the preservation of more modest structures like the row of shotgun houses on the same block that I showed in an earlier slide. The rest of the district has not been as systematically preserved, despite the efforts of the Historic Development Corporation. Some structures retain their historic functions, like the Royal Peacock, still a working nightclub, and houses of worship, like Big Bethel. Others have been preserved and adaptively reused, like the Oddfellows Building and the Dobbs Building, now home to Apex Museum. In 1992, the National Trust added Sweet Auburn to its list of America's most endangered historic places. Although the residential portion of Sweet Auburn has enjoyed a distinct turnaround, unfortunately, along with gentrification throughout the old Fourth Ward, the commercial area concentrated on Auburn has not fared as well. So we see a very mixed record of preservation along this strip, such as the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, founded by Alonzo Herndon, which is, as you can see, in an indifferent state of repair and looks probably worse even today, and the Herndon Building down the street, which was left to decline and was eventually mostly torn down after a tornado in 2008, as well as smaller scale retail structures, which, as we can see, are hit and miss in terms of their preservation and adaptive reuse.